ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
It was an incredible moment. After years behind bars, Julian Assange was free and boarding a flight out of the UK. A plea deal had been reached with the US, and soon the 52-year-old will be back on Australian soil. But why did he finally plead guilty? And what's next for the WikiLeaks founder? Today, Peter Greste, a former Al Jazeera journalist who was jailed in Egypt for 13 months. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is set to avoid prison time in the United States and possibly return to Australia after accepting a plea deal with the US government.
Julian Assange, according to WikiLeaks, has been released from a British prison and flown out of the UK.
He is likely to be credited for the time he has already served and face no new jail time.
This period of our lives, I'm confident now, has come to an end. And I think that by this time next week, Julian will be free.
Peter, you know this feeling, don't you?
Yes.
The moment you're released from jail, you're free.
Yeah, it's a weird one. It's especially after the kind of time that Julian has spent in prison. You know, it's been many, many years. The whole ordeal started when he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy back in 2012. And, it's been ongoing ever since then. Incarceration is a special form of torture, and particularly the kind of solitary confinement that he's been enduring in Belmarsh prison for the past few years. And so being released from that is this very, very strange, discombobulating mix of joy and elation, but also a degree of trepidation and disorientation. It's a very, very strange experience.
Yeah, I bet. And we saw those images of him getting on a charter plane at Stansted Airport in London. He's dressed in jeans, he's got a blue shirt on. He looked kind of pale, but not unhealthy, I thought.
Yeah, although it is difficult to tell from those images.
Yes.
And again, I think we know that he's been suffering from ill health. There have been quite a few court appearances that he was unable to make because of his health, even appearances that were supposed to be by video link. And also, I wouldn't underestimate the kind of psychological stress that he's been through. And, those sorts of things don't necessarily appear on your face when you walk out of prison.
Yes.
His journey home, I think, will take a lot longer than the flight back to Australia.
Yes, of course. His wife, Stellas, she put out a message on YouTube.
Throughout the years of Julian's imprisonment and persecution, an incredible movement has been formed. A movement of people from all walks of life, from around the world, who support not just Julian and not just us and our family, but what Julian stands for, truth and justice.
The relief for her, for his family, for his supporters must be absolutely palpable at this point.
Look, yeah, and remember, everyone has been fighting for such a long time. There have been so many false starts that you tend to give up on hope. You tend to abandon hope. And in fact, I remember when I was in Egypt, I realised that the best strategy was to give up on hope. That's not to say that you give up, but just to stop hoping or expecting things to come as a result of the campaign. And so they've been through so many ups and downs that I bet a lot of them would scarcely have believed that this day would ever come.
Yes.
And it's going to take a while for both Julian and his family and his supporters to really, for this to sink in and to process what it all means.
So, Peter, just tell me, what do we know about this plea deal that Julian Assange has done with the United States?
What we know is that he's agreed to plead guilty to one charge of espionage, and the sentence that the Justice Department has agreed to is effectively the time that he's spent in Belmarsh prison, which is why he's been allowed to go free effectively. Mm-hmm. I think that it raises all sorts of rather interesting and potentially troubling consequences, though. Originally, the Obama administration decided not to prosecute Julian Assange for espionage because of what became known as the New York Times effect, because of the precedent that it would set that would make it very difficult for the administration not to then prosecute the news organisations that subsequently published a lot of the information that WikiLeaks exposed. Now, I don't know whether this guilty plea sets that precedent. I think it is troubling to see this. I'm not blaming Julian there's no suggestion that Julian is responsible for this, but I think we need to think very carefully about what it means more broadly for press freedom, but also certainly the message that it sends to any other journalists who are considering similar stories and their sources, the whistleblowers who may be sitting on information about government wrongdoing and looking at Julian's case and thinking, I'm not sure that this is really worth the risk.
Yeah, of course he was facing a lot more charges though, wasn't he? You know, the argument was that he could have been put in jail for something like 170 years. That was the maximum penalty he could have faced in the United States.
That's right. And the charges were incredibly extensive.
Assange shot to fame when WikiLeaks began publishing secret documents provided by former US intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning. Now the 48-year-old is wanted in the US to face 18 charges related to hacking and espionage.
And this is clearly a deal that has been done to get Julian's case out of the way before the election. I think it's a great deal for Julian. I think it's useful. It's obviously very useful for the US government. And we absolutely need to be celebrating this. And it's just going to take some time before we work out what the outcome actually means for press freedom more broadly.
Just let's unpack then, Peter, a bit more the significance of that guilty plea, which you've just spoken briefly of. Because, of course, Julian Assange, he fought for so long against his extradition to the United States that he was not guilty.
That's right.
That he was a journalist exposing war crimes committed by forces in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Now he says he is guilty on one of the charges. That is a significant decision to make, isn't it?
An incredibly difficult one. You know, I expect that Julian, if and when he eventually starts talking about this, will underline that he doesn't believe that he's guilty. I certainly don't believe that he's guilty of espionage. He has been basically put in a position, I think, where he had no choice but to agree to a plea bargain. The alternatives were really very, very grim indeed, and I don't think anybody would begrudge him agreeing to this particular deal, which has effectively allowed him to go home, even if he has been forced to plead guilty to something that I'm pretty sure he believes he didn't do or should never have been charged with.
And as you say, you understand why he has now pleaded guilty to one of those charges, but your worry is that it will stop other journalists exposing secrets?
Yes, I mean, it's impossible to quantify the stories not told. We will never know how many journalists or whistleblowers might have been frightened off by this case, but it's hard to imagine that haven't been a few journalists or their sources who've been looking at Julian's case and thought, no, this is just not worth the risk. It's the price is or the potential price is too high to pay. But it may well have consequences for other forms of journalism that use similar leaks, particularly where journalists are publishing internationally. And that's really the key point here, that whatever you think about Julian's, whether you think he's a journalist or not, the fact is that his case, his disclosures have had really important implications for journalism and for the role that journalism plays in holding governments to account.
Although his critics argue, and of course the United States argued, that he was never a journalist, and what he did, it threatened US national security by exposing secrets, and that the harshest of punishments was needed because of that.
Well, look, there are two things here. I personally, I've been criticised quite widely for suggesting or disagreeing that Julian is a journalist, and I think that's because journalism, which is what I prefer to talk about, is a very particular way of gathering, organising and presenting information in line with a set of professional ethics and standards. And I just don't see, I've looked closely at what WikiLeaks did, and I don't see that they made that standard. But I do not, under any circumstances, want to take away from the implications of this case for journalism more broadly, because of what it means for, as I said earlier, for the New York Times effect, for the flow-on effects of this to other forms of journalism. But also, I don't want to take away from what I saw as the injustice in Julian's case. And again, yes, I can see that the government might have argued that he undermined security, but he also exposed abuses of government power and abuses that led to the deaths of many, many civilians. I mean, you only need to look at the original collateral murder video that showed an airstrike on a group of unarmed people. Horrific, absolutely horrific images that included the deaths of a couple of Reuters journalists.
Anybody has element? We got an RPG. All right, we got a guy with an RPG. I'm gonna fire. Light them all up. Come on, fire.
On the one hand, national security is one thing, but when it leads to the deaths of innocent people on the other, then you really need to defend the avenues that expose that kind of information and hold governments to account.
At the time we're recording, he's on his way, Julian Assange, to a court in the Northern Mariana Islands in the middle of the Pacific, halfway between the US and Australia, for a judge, of course, to sign off on this deal. It's not mainland United States. I gather that they wanted to avoid that. He did not want to go to mainland America.
Yeah, and it's perfectly understandable why he'd want to avoid stepping foot on mainland USA. This is a good way out. I know when I left Egypt, I went straight to Cyprus, which was the nearest island to Egypt, but also didn't have an extradition treaty with Egypt and allowed me to basically sit comfortably and take the next steps, work out where to go from there.
And that moment, Peter, when you touch Australian soil again, what did that feel like for you? Because I assume it's going to feel a bit similar for him.
Yeah, that was the moment I really felt that I was free. That moment when I stepped foot off the plane and walked into the arrivals hall in Brisbane Airport and saw this huge crowd of supporters cheering and waving, that I realised that actually this whole terrifying ordeal was finally over. And I suspect it'll be very much the same for Julian. I think he really won't believe that it's over. He won't feel it in his heart until he steps foot back on Australian soil and is in the arms of his family here.
Yeah, absolutely. What a moment that will be when he touches down. So, Peter, what now then for Julian Assange, do you think? What do Australians make of him?
I think it's impossible to speak of Australians as if there's one unified opinion. He's a divisive figure. But I think, by and large, Australians are reasonably united in recognising that enough is enough, that he has suffered more than enough, that the information that WikiLeaks exposed was vitally important and needed to be in the public domain. And so I think he will receive a hero's reception when he finally steps off the plane in Australia.
Peter Greste is a former Al Jazeera journalist who was arrested in Egypt in 2013 and jailed for 400 days. He's now a professor of journalism at Macquarie University and the executive director of the Alliance for Journalists' Freedom. This episode was produced by Bridget Fitzgerald with audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.